Baghdad did not survive by brilliance alone. Between 410 and 900 AD, this vast capital endured through restraint. Fire was reduced, light rationed, movement slowed. Streets, homes, and bodies learned limits. What remained was not decline, but an urban discipline quiet enough to last, steady enough to carry empire through ordinary days, without spectacle attached. If these quiet stories of the past help your breathing slow and your thoughts soften into the night, you are always welcome to remain here. We would be grateful for your subscription, as it quietly supports long-form storytelling without noise, urgency, or performance. It helps protect this calm space where history moves at its own pace and speaks in a low voice. Your presence allows more evenings like this to exist, more patience, more stillness, more careful listening. There is no rush. Return whenever the world feels too loud. We will be here, quietly waiting. If this quiet hour feels comfortable, you're welcome to stay. We hope you will choose to subscribe, helping these calm nights continue, one story at a time. No rush, no noise, just history moving slowly together. Life inside Abbasid Baghdad, 410 and 900 AD, how a medieval capital sustained itself by limiting fire, light, and movement. Baghdad does not announce itself at the beginning of this story. It does not arrive with trumpets or banners, or the confident noise of a capital that knows its name will be remembered. Instead, it is already there, settled, breathing, wide enough to contain contradictions, calm enough to carry them without comment. The city begins not with ambition but with balance, and balance in a place like Baghdad is never accidental. Between 410 and 900 AD, Baghdad learned something quietly important. Not how to grow, not how to impress, but how to last. This was not a city obsessed with comfort, nor was it ruled by the idea that more activity meant more life. Baghdad endured by learning where to stop. It limited fire, it dimmed light, it slowed movement, not because it lacked resources, but because it understood cost. And it understood that cities, like people, do not survive by exhausting themselves. Baghdad sat near water, not forests. The Tigris flowed generously, but trees did not. Firewood was not something you gathered casually. It arrived by boat, by cart, by effort. It was counted, measured, respected. Fire was not a background element here. It was a decision, a choice made carefully, often reluctantly. Flames were kept low, cooking fires were efficient. Heat was directed, not displayed. A household did not glow. It functioned. And that distinction mattered. Light followed the same logic. Lamps existed, of course, oil burned, wicks were trimmed. But illumination was never assumed. Light was expensive, both materially and physically. Too much light meant more fuel, more smoke, more fatigue. Eyes tired, lungs complained. So Baghdad did not try to banish darkness. It negotiated with it. Rooms were lit only as much as needed. Corners remained unambitious. Shadows were allowed to stay where they fell. The city did not demand visibility everywhere. It accepted partial knowing. Movement, too, was moderated. Baghdad was not restless at all hours. Streets were active when they needed to be and still when they did not. Constant motion was not a virtue. It was a cost. Walking required attention. Travel required purpose. Wandering was not romanticized. The city did not celebrate unnecessary circulation. It understood the bodies wear down, that noise accumulates, that constant presence eventually becomes pressure. So Baghdad practiced pause. not silence exactly, just restraint. Homes reflected this philosophy. They were inward-looking, courtyards held the center, not windows. Life gathered around shaded spaces, not outward display. Heat was managed by architecture long before fire became involved. Walls absorbed warmth slowly. Rooms remained cool by design. There was no expectation that a house should feel evenly comfortable. Comfort was localized. You sat where it worked. You slept where it made sense. The building did not adapt to you. You adapted to it. And somehow that felt reasonable. Public spaces followed similar patterns. Markets were lively, but not endless. Activity peaked and receded. Nothing stayed fully awake. Even places of learning respected limits. Scholars did not chase brilliance through exhaustion. Reading lamps were used sparingly. Knowledge was preserved through routine, not insomnia. The great irony is that Baghdad became a center of learning precisely because it did not burn itself out trying to be awake all the time. Ideas survived here because people rested. Smoke was part of the arrangement, not admired, not dramatized, simply tolerated. Fires burned low and long, producing smoke that lingered in enclosed spaces. This was not ideal. No one pretended it was. But smoke was familiar. It meant warmth without waste. It meant continuity. People accepted discomfort when it came with stability. Baghdad was not a city that chased perfection. It preferred reliability. Smoke could be lived with. Cold or exhaustion could not. The city also understood scale. Baghdad was large, larger than most people could fully experience. And that was fine. No one needed to touch every street. No one needed to see every district. The city functioned through partial engagement. Neighborhoods were worlds unto themselves. Movement between them was deliberate. You did not drift endlessly across Baghdad. You belonged somewhere. That sense of containment was not restrictive. It was protective. It allowed the city to be vast without being overwhelming. There is a temptation to imagine Baghdad in this period as constantly vibrant, endlessly active, permanently illuminated by intellectual energy. The truth is gentler. Much of Baghdad's success came from its willingness to slow down, to stop working when work was finished, to close spaces that did not need to remain open, to accept that a city does not prove its greatness by staying awake longer than its inhabitants. Even governance reflected this rhythm. Administration had hours, systems functioned within boundaries. Nothing suggested that authority required constant presence. Power did not pace the streets at all times. It trusted process. It trusted habit. Baghdad governed itself through repetition, not spectacle. The city did not shout its order. It practiced it quietly. Food preparation followed similar lines. Meals were cooked with efficiency in mind. Fires were used fully, then allowed to fade. Leftover heat mattered. Nothing was rushed, nothing theatrical. Eating was part of daily rhythm, not an event demanding excess. The city did not confuse abundance with waste. Plenty existed, but it moved carefully through hands that understood seasons and supply. The most remarkable thing about Abbasid Baghdad may be how little it tried to impress itself. It did not build systems assuming infinite energy. It did not plan for constant expansion of effort. Instead, it designed life around endurance. The city assumed fatigue. It assumed limitation. And by doing so, it made space for continuity. There's a quiet humor in this. Baghdad, remembered as a center of brilliance, sustained that brilliance by being deeply unflashy in its daily habits. Lamps turned down, fires kept small, streets allowed to empty, movement reduced to necessity. It is not the story people expect, but it is the story that works. In this way, Baghdad resembles a seasoned traveler rather than a conquering hero. It knows when to stop walking. It sits down before collapsing. It drinks water before thirst becomes desperation. The city listens to its own limits, and limits, when respected, become structure rather than failure. Nothing here is dramatic, and that is precisely the point. Life inside Abbasid Baghdad was not about constant achievement. It was about sustaining a complex urban organism without tearing it apart through excess. The city survived not by brilliance alone, but by discipline disguised as calm. Baghdad did not burn brighter than others. It burned longer, carefully, intentionally, with just enough fire to cook, just enough light to see, just enough movement to function. And when those needs were met, it stopped. The city rested without apology, not because it was weak, but because it understood something many places forget. Survival is not an act of intensity. It is an agreement with moderation. And so Baghdad continues, not in flame or glare, but in balance. A city that lasted because it knew how to keep things small. And in that restraint, something quietly remarkable happens. Baghdad becomes legible to itself, not all at once, not dramatically, but through repetition, through evenings that end when they are finished, through streets that do not insist on being used simply because they exist, through homes that understand their limits and never argue with them. The city does not demand attention from its people. It makes room for them to step back. There is no sense of urgency here, no pressure to optimize the moment. Life unfolds at a pace that assumes tomorrow will come, and that assumption changes everything. When a city believes in continuity, it stops trying to extract meaning from every hour. It allows time to be ordinary. And ordinary time, repeated carefully, becomes stability. Even sound is managed gently. Baghdad does not aim for silence, but it avoids noise that serves no purpose. Voices lower naturally. Tools are put away when their work is done. Doors close not with finality, but with familiarity. Nothing announces the transition from activity to rest. It simply happens, as it always has. The city is not sentimental about itself. It does not pause to admire its own endurance. It just keeps going in the way things do when they are well arranged. People inside Baghdad are not constantly aware that they live in a capital. They live in rooms, on streets, near courtyards. They move through spaces sized for human breath, not historical memory. This is perhaps the most important detail. Baghdad does not live as a monument. It lives as a place where daily choices accumulate quietly, where survival is not heroic but procedural, where restraint is not framed as loss but as good sense. The city's strength lies not in what it adds but in what it declines to overuse. Fire remains small because it should. Light remains limited because eyes and fuel both tire. Movement slows because bodies are not meant to perform endlessly. These are not moral decisions. They are practical ones. And practicality, repeated across generations, becomes culture. Baghdad teaches something subtle, that endurance is rarely loud, that lasting systems do not shine constantly, that a city can be powerful without being exhausting. It can hold knowledge without burning through those who carry it. It can remain vast without demanding full participation at every moment. Nothing here feels rushed. Nothing strains to impress. And that, in the end, is why Baghdad continues to matter. Not as a spectacle frozen in brilliance, but as a living example of how limitation can become design, and how design, when respected, becomes survival. The city does not ask for more than it can sustain. It keeps its fire measured, its light modest, its movement intentional, and in doing so, it remains present, night after night, year after year, quietly intact. Baghdad does not fade because it rests. It lasts because it knows when enough is enough. Baghdad does not begin as an idea in this story. It begins as a place already in use. People are already awake. Others are already finished for the day. Doors are being closed without ceremony. Fires are adjusted rather than fed. Nothing announces a transition. Life simply rearranges itself into a quieter shape. This is important because Baghdad between 410 and 900 AD does not survive by dramatic moments. It survives by repetition, by small decisions made so often they stop feeling like decisions at all. How much fire is enough? How much light is reasonable? How far one really needs to go today? These are not philosophical questions. They are habits. And habits, when shared across a city, become structure. Baghdad is large, but it does not behave as if it needs to fill its own size at every moment. There is no anxiety about unused space. Streets are allowed to empty. Rooms are allowed to dim. Not every corner demands attention. The city does not confuse motion with vitality. It understands that constant activity has a cost, and that cost is paid by bodies, fuel, and time. What makes Baghdad unusual is not its brilliance, but its discipline. Fire is present but controlled. Light exists but is never assumed. Movement happens, but only where it serves a purpose. The city does not push against its limits. It organizes itself around them. This is not restraint born of fear. It is restraint born of experience. In Baghdad, nothing is wasted trying to prove that the city is alive. Life is evident without effort. Meals are cooked efficiently. Work concludes when it should. Knowledge is preserved through routine rather than exhaustion. Even ambition here learns to keep reasonable hours. There is a quiet humor in this. One of the most influential capitals of the medieval world is held together not by excess, but by moderation. Not by spectacle, but by people knowing when to stop. Baghdad does not run itself like a performance. It runs itself like a household that expects to be here tomorrow. This is not a story about decline, nor is it a celebration of comfort. It is a study in maintenance, in how a city learns to remain functional without burning through its own foundations, how limitation becomes a tool rather than a failure, how a capital sustains itself by refusing to be constantly impressive. To understand Baghdad in this period, we do not need to look for moments of greatness. We need to observe how the city manages ordinary time, because it is there in the quiet logic of daily life that Baghdad reveals how it lasted. Baghdad was planned for daylight, not for night. Baghdad was not imagined in darkness. It was conceived in light. When the city was first laid out, its geometry answered the sun, not the stars. Streets were measured for visibility, courtyards open to the sky, Walls caught warmth during the day and released it slowly into the evening. Administration moved when shadows were short. Trade flourished when hands could see what they were touching. Knowledge traveled on paper and parchment that preferred daylight and rested when it faded. Baghdad in its bones assumed the presence of the sun. This was not a mistake. It was simply honest. Baghdad was planned for administration, for commerce, for learning, for movement that had a beginning and an end. It was designed for people who woke with purpose and expected the day to be used. Nothing in the city's original vision suggested constant activity. No planner assumed endless illumination. No architect believed the city needed to perform at all hours to justify its existence. Baghdad was built to work well while the light was available and to step back when it was not. And so when the sun lowered itself beyond the horizon, the city did not collapse. It adjusted. This adjustment was never announced. There was no signal, no bell rang to inform Baghdad that it was now required to behave differently. Instead, the city softened. Edges blurred. Movement slowed, not because of fear, but because it made sense to slow. Activity did not cease. It simply learned to occupy less space. Baghdad at night was not a different city. It was the same city, using fewer muscles. Fire became smaller. This was not symbolic, it was practical. Wood was not abundant, and charcoal was not something one wasted casually. Fires were not built to impress. They were built to last just long enough. Cooking fires finished their work and were not revived unnecessarily. Heat was directed, not spread. A household did not aim to warm every corner. It warmed the place where people gathered, sat, or lay down. The rest of the room remained politely uninvolved. Light followed the same discipline. Oil lamps were used with care. Wicks were trimmed thoughtfully, as if they might be offended by excess. No one expected a room to glow simply because it existed. Illumination was applied where needed and withdrawn when it was not. Darkness was not treated as a failure of planning. It was accepted as part of the city's rhythm. Shadows did not signal danger. They signaled that the day had done its work. Movement changed as well. During daylight hours, Baghdad moved confidently. Couriers walked with direction. Merchants knew their routes. Scholars traveled between homes, libraries, and places of discussion with clear intent. The city understood purposeful motion. But after sunset, movement became selective. Walking was no longer something done casually. You went where you meant to go. You did not wander for the sake of wandering. Streets were not stages. They were passages. This did not make Baghdad anxious. Quite the opposite. The city seemed relieved to narrow its focus. It no longer needed to accommodate every possibility at once. It could afford to be specific. Buildings, too, participated in this quiet recalibration. Homes were designed inward, not outward. Windows were not invitations. Courtyards absorbed the remaining warmth of the day and released it gently. Walls did not attempt to fight the night. They negotiated with it. Thick masonry slowed change. Interiors became stable environments, less concerned with the external world once the light receded. The city's great institutions reflected this same understanding. Administrative buildings did not demand presence at all hours. Records waited, decisions paused. Governance here was not a performance that required constant motion. It functioned because it respected limits. Power did not pace restlessly through the streets. It trusted routine to hold things in place until morning. Even centers of learning understood restraint. Baghdad would later be remembered for its scholars, its translators, its preservation of knowledge. But that work did not happen through exhaustion. Lamps were expensive, eyes tired, minds wandered when pushed too far. Scholars worked when conditions supported attention and rested when they did not. Knowledge here was treated as something to be protected, not squeezed. There is a quiet irony in this. A city celebrated for its intellectual energy depended deeply on stillness. Thought required pause. Reading required light that was neither too dim nor too abundant. Writing required bodies that were not worn thin by unnecessary effort. Baghdad's achievements rested on moderation that few histories bother to mention. Trade followed similar patterns. Markets thrived during the day. Goods moved visibly, audibly, confidently. At night, commerce retreated without complaint. Stalls closed, goods were secured. There was no sense of loss in this withdrawal. Trade did not need to prove its vitality by staying awake. It trusted the return of daylight. What Baghdad demonstrates quietly and consistently is that a city does not need to conquer night to survive it. It needs to cooperate with it. There was no attempt to erase darkness, no effort to turn night into a lesser version of day. Instead, Baghdad allowed the city to change state. Just as the body rests different muscles at different times, the city rested entire systems. Some continued at low intensity. Others paused completely. This was not fragility. It was efficiency. The streets themselves tell this story. Broad avenues that welcomed crowds during the day did not feel abandoned after sunset. They felt complete. Empty space was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition to be accepted. Baghdad did not fear stillness. It did not interpret quiet as decline. Silence was simply another mode of existence. And this is perhaps the most important detail. Baghdad did not measure its success by constant visibility. It did not need to be seen at all times to remain powerful. Its strength lay in the confidence that things could stop and resume without damage, that systems could pause without breaking, that people could step back without disappearing. In this way, Baghdad behaves less like a monument and more like a living organism. It understands fatigue. It anticipates limits. It distributes effort across time rather than demanding everything at once. The city does not burn brightly and briefly. It glows steadily, dimming when appropriate, brightening when useful. There is something deeply human about this. Baghdad does not pretend that people are machines. It does not design life around constant output. It allows for narrowing attention, for smaller circles of activity, for moments when nothing needs to happen at all. And because of this allowance, the city remains intact. When the sun sets, Baghdad does not lose itself. It becomes more precise. It sheds unnecessary motion. It conserves what matters. The city grows quieter not because it is afraid of the dark, but because it knows the value of rest. Baghdad was planned for daylight, yes, but what allowed it to endure was its ability to accept that daylight ends. That night arrives without asking permission, and that a city wise enough to adjust rather than resist will still be standing when the light returns. This adjustment, repeated night after night, slowly shaped how Baghdad understood itself. The city did not treat the end of daylight as a disruption. It treated it as a cue, a signal that certain forms of effort were no longer efficient, that some kinds of attention could wait, that not everything needed to be held at full tension all the time. There was a collective trust embedded in this behavior. Trust that work left unfinished would still be there tomorrow. Trust that systems did not require constant supervision to remain stable. Trust that a city could loosen its grip without falling apart. This trust was not naive. It was earned through experience, through years of watching what failed when pushed too hard and what endured when handled gently. Baghdad learned early on that energy is not infinite. Fire consumes, light drains, movement tires, and a city that ignores these truths eventually pays for it in quiet, irreversible ways. Cracked routines, frayed attention, systems that appear functional until they suddenly are not. Baghdad chose a different path. It chose conservation over display. This choice affected how people felt inside the city. There was less pressure to fill time, less urgency to remain visible. Life did not need to justify itself constantly. When activity slowed, it was not interpreted as absence. It was interpreted as readiness. The city was preparing itself, even if no one said so out loud. What is striking is how little resistance there was to this rhythm. People did not complain that the city grew quieter. They adjusted with it. They lowered voices. They stayed closer to home. They accepted that certain spaces belonged to daylight and others to rest. The transition was smooth because it was expected. No one felt deprived of something they were never promised. Baghdad did not try to simulate daylight after the sun had gone. It did not force brightness into places where it did not belong. It respected contrast. The difference between active and inactive hours gave shape to life. Without that contrast, days blur. With it, time becomes readable. This is why the city feels composed rather than strained. Baghdad is not constantly trying to outrun itself. It moves forward, then settles back. It expands, then contracts. Like breathing. Like a tide. Like something that plans to continue rather than peak. By allowing night to exist as night, Baghdad protected its daylight. Work remained meaningful because it was not endless. Movement remained purposeful because it was not constant. Fire remained useful because it was not wasted. Light remained valuable because it was not assumed. The city's planners may not have written this philosophy down, but it lived in the streets, in the homes, in the habits passed quietly, from one generation to the next. Baghdad taught its people how to stop without fear. And in doing so, it taught itself how to endure. This chapter closes not with an ending, but with a pause. Baghdad does not retreat. It simply narrows its focus. It gathers itself inward. The city remains present, intact, waiting without tension. Daylight will return, and Baghdad will be ready. Fire in Baghdad was not about warmth. Fire in Baghdad was never dramatic. It did not roar. It did not dominate rooms. It did not announce itself as a triumph over nature. If anything, fire in this city behaved with a certain modesty, as if aware that it was useful but not in charge. Baghdad was not London. It was not Scandinavia. No one here was trying to survive walls of ice or mornings where breath froze mid-sentence. The problem was never minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The problem was balance. Heat was welcome, yes, but it was not the point. Control was. In Baghdad, fire existed to serve specific tasks and then to withdraw. A small flame finished dinner when the sun lingered too long in the afternoon and hunger arrived late. Another flame discouraged insects that believed human skin was a shared resource. A quiet ember suggested presence. Someone is here. Someone is awake. Someone has not abandoned this space entirely. That was often enough. Warmth, when it came, was incidental. This is a subtle distinction, but it matters. In cold northern cities, fire defines survival. It becomes the center of the room, the heart of the household, the thing everything else arranges itself around. In Baghdad, fire was peripheral. Important, yes. Central, no. It did not organize life. Life organized it. Fuel was not infinite. Wood arrived from elsewhere. Charcoal cost money. Even dung and scraps required collection and preparation. Fire was never something one indulged in casually. You did not light a flame simply because the evening felt empty. You lit it because there was something it needed to do. And once it had done that thing, you allowed it to shrink. Most fires in Baghdad were small by design. A low flame cooks evenly. A low flame smokes less aggressively. A low flame can be managed without constant attention. It does not demand drama. It asks only to be acknowledged occasionally, like a guest who knows when to be quiet. This restraint shaped interiors. Homes were not designed to circulate heat widely. They were designed to contain it where necessary. You sat close to the source if you wanted warmth. You moved away if you did not. Rooms did not pretend to be evenly comfortable. Comfort was local, temporary, negotiated. And people adapted easily. They layered clothing. They shifted positions. They learned which corners stayed warmer longer and which were best left unused. This was not hardship. It was familiarity. Baghdad residents did not expect the environment to solve every problem for them. They participated. Fire also served a psychological role. A small flame reassured without exciting. It suggested continuity. The day had not vanished completely. Time was still moving forward in an orderly way. There was no need to illuminate the entire room to feel safe. One controlled point of light was enough to orient the body and calm the mind. Too much fire would have done the opposite. It would have produced smoke, heat, distraction. It would have turned rest into vigilance. Baghdad understood this intuitively. A flame should not compete with sleep. It should coexist with it quietly. Even in communal spaces, fire rarely became excessive. Public buildings did not blaze through the night. Administrative centers did not glow to prove authority. Fire was not used to project power. Power here did not need illumination to feel real. It trusted daylight for its work and allowed darkness to arrive without argument. This approach also reduced risk. Fewer large fires meant fewer accidents, fewer sparks, less damage. In a dense urban environment, restraint was not merely sensible, it was protective. Baghdad survived in part because it did not flirt with catastrophe unnecessarily. There is something faintly ironic in this. Fire, often imagined as a symbol of civilization, becomes in Baghdad a lesson in humility. Civilization, the city seems to say, is not about how brightly you burn. It is about how carefully. So fires stayed small. They stayed close to the ground. They stayed within limits everyone understood. Children learned early not to play with flame. Adults learned when to let it fade. No one mourned a fire that had finished its job. Extinguishing was not loss. It was completion. In this way, fire became part of the city's broader discipline. It was not warmth that mattered most, but regulation. Knowing how much was enough. Knowing when enough had been reached. Baghdad did not treat fire as an enemy or a savior. It treated it as a tool, and like all tools, it was used with intention. The city's relationship with fire mirrors its relationship with life itself. Neither is meant to overwhelm, neither is meant to consume endlessly. Both are most effective when kept within bounds. Baghdad did not survive by burning hotter than others. It survived by burning less, and knowing exactly why. This careful relationship with fire shaped how people understood safety. In Baghdad, safety was not created by brightness or by overwhelming force. It was created by predictability. A flame that behaved the same way every evening became part of the city's background rhythm. You knew how far its warmth reached. You knew how long it would last. You knew when it would fade. There were no surprises, and that absence of surprise was itself a form of comfort. Fire also taught patience. A small flame takes time. It does not rush water to boil. It does not force food to cook faster than it should. Waiting became part of the process, and waiting, repeated often enough, softened the edges of daily life. Baghdad did not hurry its evenings. The city allowed tasks to finish when they were ready, not when impatience demanded. This patience extended to social behavior. People gathered near a flame not to perform but to be present. Conversation slowed naturally. Silence did not feel awkward. There was no need to fill every moment with sound when the fire itself provided a gentle sense of continuity. In these moments, warmth was less important than reassurance. The flame did not promise comfort. It promised order. It is worth noting how little symbolism surrounded fire here. There were no grand rituals built around it in everyday life, no reverence that required excess. Fire was respected but not romanticized. It was not a metaphor for ambition or conquest. It was a reminder of limits. You could control it, but only if you stayed attentive. Neglect led to danger. Excess led to waste. Balance led to longevity. As the flame diminished, no one rushed to revive it unless there was reason. Darkness was allowed to return gradually. The room adjusted, eyes adapted, bodies settled. This was not surrender, it was alignment. Baghdad did not fight the natural cooling of the evening. It moved with it. In this way, fire became an instructor rather than a solution. It taught the city when to act and when to stop. It taught households how to measure their needs honestly. It taught the capital itself that survival was not about intensity, but about precision. Too much fire would have disrupted sleep, strained resources, and increased risk. Too little would have made life inconvenient, but not impossible. The balance between those two extremes was where Baghdad chose to live. By keeping fire small, the city preserved something larger: attention, energy, continuity. Flames came and went, but the rhythm remained. And in that rhythm, Baghdad found a quiet confidence. The city did not need to announce that it was alive. A single controlled flame, used briefly and wisely, was enough to say everything that mattered. Firewood was scarce in a river city. Baghdad lived beside water, and water has a way of misleading the imagination. Rivers suggest abundance. Flow suggests ease. To later eyes, it can feel natural to assume that a city resting along the Tigris would never worry about basic supplies. But water does not grow trees. And Baghdad, for all its canals and currents, was never a city of forests. There were palms, yes. Date palms shaped the horizon and fed the city in quiet, dependable ways. But palms are not firewood in the generous sense. They are not cut freely, burned casually, or replaced quickly. They are slow-growing, valuable, and watched. True fuel came from elsewhere, from far banks, from distant lands, from routes that required time, labor, and agreement. Firewood in Baghdad arrived already tired. It had been cut far from the city, hauled to the river, loaded onto boats, floated downstream, unloaded again, and then sold. By the time it reached a household, it carried the weight of every hand that had touched it. That weight translated into cost. Not only money, but effort, planning, and restraint. Wood was never anonymous here. You knew instinctively that it had traveled. Because of this, no one treated firewood lightly. You did not burn it simply to feel surrounded by flame. You did not let it crackle loudly into the night without purpose. Each piece had a future already attached to it. If you used it now, it would not be there later. And later always mattered. Some wood entered the city through controlled distribution. Some was purchased outright. Some arrived through networks that were informal but well understood. None of it was free. None of it was endless. Baghdad learned early that a river city without forests survives by counting what it burns. This reality shaped behavior more effectively than any rule. You did not need to be told not to build large fires at night. The city did not rely on prohibitions. Economics did the teaching quietly. A large fire meant rapid consumption. Rapid consumption meant expense. Expense meant regret. Regret was a poor companion in a city that expected tomorrow to arrive on schedule. So fires stayed small, not because people feared cold, but because they respected continuity. A small fire could cook a meal, discourage insects, provide reassurance, and then retreat without demanding more. A large fire would have done little more, while asking far too much in return. Baghdad understood this imbalance without needing to articulate it. The river, meanwhile, flowed on, indifferent to fuel shortages. It delivered goods, carried people, reflected light. But it did not solve the problem of heat. That problem remained stubbornly terrestrial. Baghdad's brilliance was in not pretending otherwise. The city did not imagine that proximity to water excused excess. It adapted to the limits of its landscape rather than fighting them. Nighttime made this adaptation visible. During the day, trade could disguise scarcity. Movement created the impression of abundance. But at night, when activity narrowed, fuel decisions became clearer. A large blaze would have stood out immediately. It would have been noticed, questioned. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. Baghdad did not admire unnecessary displays. Homes reflected this economy of flame. Fireplaces where they existed were modest. Cooking areas were compact. Heat was directed downward and inward, not outward. You warmed people, not rooms. You cooked food, not air. Anything else would have been extravagant in a way that felt faintly irresponsible. Even wealth did not entirely escape this logic. Richer households could afford more fuel, but they did not behave as if fuel had become infinite. Social expectation discouraged waste. Burning too much at night suggested poor judgment rather than success. Baghdad valued competence more than spectacle. Knowing how to manage resources was a sign of belonging. There is a quiet discipline embedded in this. A city that depends on distant supplies cannot afford to be impulsive. It learns to think in increments, one piece of wood at a time, one flame at a time. This incremental thinking slowed Baghdad's nights in a way that felt natural rather than imposed. Large fires were rare, not because they were banned, but because they did not fit. The absence of forests shaped more than fuel use. It shaped mentality. Baghdad residents were aware that some things must be imported, some negotiated, some preserved carefully. Firewood was simply the most visible example. When you live in a place where resources travel to you rather than surrounding you, waste becomes conspicuous. So when darkness arrived, the city did not try to recreate daylight with fire. It accepted that fuel was precious and acted accordingly. Lamps dimmed, fires lowered, movement contracted. This was not austerity. It was alignment. Baghdad behaved in a way that matched its geography. And because of this, the city remained stable. It did not burn through its reserves in moments of impatience. It did not pretend to be something it was not. It lived as a river city, without forests should live, carefully, attentively, and without embarrassment about limits. Large fires belong to places where wood grows nearby and replaces itself quickly. Baghdad belonged to a different category. Here, restraint was not moral virtue. It was environmental literacy. So at night, flames stayed small, not out of fear, not out of poverty, but out of understanding. The city knew where its fuel came from, and it knew better than to forget that fact simply because the sun had gone down. This awareness settled into daily instinct. People did not calculate firewood each evening with visible concern. They felt it instead. The hand reached for one piece, not two. The flame was adjusted downward almost automatically. No one needed to announce moderation. It lived in the body, passed along like a habit too ordinary to name. Baghdad did not ration firewood with fear. It rationed it with familiarity. Over time, this scarcity refined judgment. A good household was not one that burned brightly, but one that burned correctly. Too much flame suggested inexperience. Too little suggested neglect. The right amount signaled competence. And competence, in Baghdad, carried more social weight than display. A person who knew how to manage fuel was assumed to know how to manage other things as well. This is why nights in Baghdad never glowed evenly. Light appeared in pockets, then disappeared again. Fires did their work and withdrew. The city did not attempt to level itself into uniform warmth or brightness. Variation was expected. Some spaces were active, others dormant. That unevenness was not a flaw. It was evidence of a city using only what it needed. The river continued its steady movement beside all of this, unconcerned. Boats arrived, boats departed. Fuel entered the city in measured amounts, and the city responded with measured use. Nothing about this process felt tense. Baghdad was not anxious about scarcity. It simply respected it. The absence of forests did not make the city fragile. It made it attentive. And attention changes behavior quietly. It shortens fires. It lowers flames. It encourages people to sit closer together rather than heating empty space. It turns excess into something faintly embarrassing rather than desirable. Baghdad learned to live comfortably within these boundaries, not because it had no choice, but because the alternative made little sense. By the time night fully settled, the city had already made its decisions. Fires were set at the size they would remain. No one planned to enlarge them later without reason. There was comfort in this predictability. The flame you saw at one moment would not suddenly demand more from you. It would finish its task and fade, as expected. In a river city without forests, Firewood teaches humility. It reminds people that some resources do not surround you. They arrive by effort and leave by use. Baghdad absorbed this lesson deeply, and so, when darkness came, the city did not challenge it with large fires. It acknowledged the limits of what had traveled so far to reach it. The result was not deprivation, but continuity. Small flames, carefully maintained, allowed Baghdad to remain itself without strain. The city stayed warm enough, bright enough, active enough. And then it stopped. Not because it could not continue, but because it did not need to. Alternative fuels were quiet and uncelebrated. In Baghdad, the fuels that mattered most were rarely named with pride. They did not arrive with stories attached. They were not praised in writing, sung about, or carefully distinguished by elegant terminology. They existed below that level of attention, in the category of things that worked, and therefore did not need explanation. These fuels were ordinary in the deepest sense of the word. Rotten wood was used when sound wood was unnecessary. Not the kind fit for construction or careful carving, but pieces already softened by time, lighter in weight, less ambitious in flame. Charcoal fragments were gathered and saved, the broken remains of something once whole. Dry waste, prepared patiently and without ceremony, burned with little enthusiasm but reliable persistence. Reused materials, passed through several lives already, found one more purpose before becoming ash. None of this was poetic, and none of it needed to be. Baghdad did not require romance from its fuel. It required duration. These materials burned quietly. They did not leap or crackle loudly. They did not throw light far across a room. They produced heat slowly with minimal attention, and they did so for long enough that people could stop thinking about them. That was their value. A fuel that demands admiration also demands supervision. Baghdad preferred fuels that could be trusted to behave. There are no heroic records of these materials. No chronicler pauses to describe the careful reuse of fuel scraps. No scholar notes the beauty of a low, persistent ember made from something already discarded. These choices were too practical to attract attention. They belonged to households, not to histories. But they shaped the city as much as any visible monument. Alternative fuels fit Baghdad's broader logic. When firewood is scarce and expensive, you do not ask a flame to perform more than necessary. You give it something modest to consume, something that will last without insisting on brightness. A flame fed by such materials becomes less of an event and more of a condition. It is there, then it is not. And while it is there, it behaves. This behavior mattered most during long stretches of inactivity, when the city narrowed its focus and nothing urgent remained to be done. People did not want a fire that required constant adjustment. They wanted something steady, something predictable, something that would continue without persuasion. Alternative fuels provided exactly that. They allowed time to pass without interruption. The absence of ceremony around these fuels is telling. Baghdad did not treat them as symbols of poverty or ingenuity. They were simply part of the environment. Everyone knew how to prepare them. Everyone knew how they burned. Children grew up understanding which materials lasted longer and which burned too quickly to be useful. This knowledge was practical, not theoretical. It was learned by observation, not instruction. Using such fuels also reduced risk. Large flames fed by fresh wood could flare unexpectedly. Sparks could escape. Smoke could become aggressive. Low-burning materials behaved differently. They smoldered. They stayed close to the ground. They did not demand attention. In a dense urban setting, this quietness was not a flaw. It was a safeguard. There is a certain irony in how invisible this system becomes to later observers. When people imagine Baghdad, they often picture brilliance, activity, light. They imagine a city glowing with intellectual energy. What they rarely imagine is the patience of a household tending a small, unremarkable fire made from whatever could be spared. And yet this patience is part of what allowed that brilliance to exist at all. These fuels did not inspire conversation. No one gathered to admire them. They did not become metaphors. They did not appear in praise or condemnation. Their success lay in their ability to disappear into the background. They burned long enough for the evening to pass. That was all anyone asked of them. The city itself seemed to approve of this modesty. Baghdad did not reward excess. It rewarded continuity. A fire that lasted quietly without drawing attention fit neatly into a culture that valued steadiness over display. Using alternative fuels was not a sign of hardship. It was a sign of understanding. It meant you knew the difference between what looked impressive and what actually worked. Even wealth did not always change this behavior. A larger household might have access to better fuel, but it still understood the advantage of materials that burned slowly and without fuss. Showing off through fire made little sense. It created more problems than it solved. Baghdad's social environment discouraged that kind of waste. Competence was admired. Excess was tolerated at best. And so these fuels remained unnamed, uncelebrated, and essential. They passed from hand to hand, from use to use, until nothing remained but ash. That ash, too, had its place. It was swept away, reused where possible, returned quietly to the city's cycle of materials. Nothing insisted on finality. In this way, alternative fuels became part of Baghdad's deeper rhythm. They allowed people to stop paying attention to fire and turn their attention elsewhere, to conversation, to rest, to nothing at all. The city did not require constant engagement with its mechanisms. It allowed them to run quietly in the background. There is something deeply calming about this arrangement. A city that does not demand admiration for its survival is a city that feels stable. Baghdad did not dramatize its endurance, it practiced it. Night after night, small, unremarkable fuels burned just long enough, not to impress, not to conquer darkness, but to let time move forward without interruption. And when they were gone, no one mourned them. They had done what they were meant to do. The night had passed. The city remained. That was enough. Over time, this quiet use of alternative fuels shaped the emotional tone of domestic life. Fires were no longer the center of attention. They were background companions, present without asking to be noticed. People did not sit watching flames. They sat beside them, letting the heat exist, without commentary. The absence of spectacle made room for something else: ease. A room did not feel alive because a fire was dramatic. It felt alive because nothing demanded effort. These fuels also taught the city how to accept imperfection. They did not burn evenly. They did not always smell pleasant. Sometimes they smoked more than expected. Sometimes they needed a small adjustment. But Baghdad did not chase ideal conditions. It adapted. Windows opened briefly, doors shifted, people moved a little closer or a little farther away. Life continued without complaint. Comfort here was flexible, not absolute. There was a kind of shared understanding around this. Everyone knew that these materials were not chosen because they were beautiful. They were chosen because they were available, sufficient, and familiar. That familiarity removed anxiety. You did not worry about running out suddenly. You knew how long they would last. You knew what to expect. Predictability in a city this large was a quiet luxury. Alternative fuels also reinforced the city's broader ethic of reuse. Nothing entered the household with only one purpose. Materials passed through stages. What could no longer support one task found another. Fire did not discriminate. It accepted what was offered and transformed it gently. This cycle felt natural in Baghdad, a place where continuity mattered more than novelty. Because these fuels required little attention, they allowed evenings to dissolve gradually rather than end abruptly. There was no sharp moment when the fire went out and darkness took over. Light faded slowly, heat softened. The body adjusted without noticing the transition. This gradualness mattered. It eased the mind. It allowed rest to arrive without being summoned. In this way, the city learned to let time pass without interference. Nothing pushed, nothing rushed. The night moved forward at its own pace, carried by low flames that neither resisted nor accelerated it. Baghdad did not demand progress from every hour. Some hours were allowed to simply exist. What makes this remarkable is how rarely it appears in records. These fuels leave little trace. They produce no monuments, they inspire no poetry, and yet they supported the ordinary life that made everything else possible. Without them, the city would have been louder, brighter, more fragile. With them, it remained composed. So these materials stayed in the margins of history, unnamed and uncelebrated. But within the city, they were trusted. They did not fail. They did not surprise. They did not ask for praise. They burned long enough, quietly enough, for the night to pass without incident. And when morning came, nothing about them needed to be remembered. They had already done their work. Smoke was an accepted companion. In Abbasid Baghdad, smoke was not treated as a problem waiting to be solved. It was not evidence of poor design or failed technique. It was simply part of living. Smoke meant that something had burned, that food had been cooked, that insects had been discouraged, that a household had chosen survival over ideal conditions. It lingered not because people were careless, but because they understood trade-offs and accepted them calmly. Homes in Baghdad were not built to chase perfect airflow. Windows were small, openings were narrow, roofs sat low and close, designed to hold warmth, shade interiors, and protect from heat and dust more than to release smoke efficiently. When a fire burned, the smoke did not rush away. It stayed. It curled along beams, drifted across ceilings, and settled into fabrics. No one panicked. This was expected. It had always been expected. Smoke was familiar enough that it barely registered. Eyes adjusted. Lungs learned patience. People shifted position slightly, choosing where to sit, where to rest, where to let the air thin. Baghdad did not imagine a world without smoke. It imagined a world where smoke was manageable. And that difference shaped everything. To later minds, smoke suggests discomfort, To Baghdad, it suggested continuity. A house without smoke felt empty, too clean, too still. Smoke meant a fire was present, even if small, and a fire, however modest, meant presence. Someone was here. Someone had chosen not to disappear into darkness entirely. In a city that valued restraint, that quiet signal mattered. The idea of eliminating smoke completely would have required changes Baghdad did not seek. Larger openings meant more heat loss during cooler seasons and more dust during hot ones. Higher ceilings meant more materials, more labor, more expense. Constant ventilation meant more movement of air than the city required. Baghdad did not pursue theoretical improvement at the cost of practical balance. It accepted what worked well enough. There was also a subtle comfort in smoke's persistence. Total darkness was unsettling, not frightening in a dramatic sense, but disorienting. A faint haze in the air caught the light of a small lamp, softened edges, blurred sharp contrasts. Shadows moved gently instead of cutting cleanly. Rooms felt occupied even when people were quiet. Smoke softened the environment, making it easier for the body to settle. This acceptance was not resignation. It was cultural familiarity. Children grew up with smoke as part of the household atmosphere. It did not signal danger unless it changed character. Thick smoke meant something was wrong. Thin smoke meant things were proceeding as expected. People learned to read it instinctively, the way one reads weather or mood. Baghdad did not imagine that comfort meant clarity. It did not demand perfect air in exchange for warmth, light, and stability. Instead, it balanced imperfect elements into a livable whole. Smoke, warmth, dim light, stillness. None of these were ideal on their own. Together they formed something sustainable. There is a quiet irony here. Modern spaces often strive for purity, for invisible systems, for air that leaves no trace. Baghdad lived differently. It allowed its systems to be felt. Smoke reminded people that energy was being used, that fuel was being consumed, that life required exchange. Nothing happened without consequence, but consequences could be lived with. This was a habit of the period, not an exception. Across the city, smoke was tolerated, adjusted around, and rarely discussed. It did not become a symbol of hardship. It was simply the price of warmth, light, and presence, and Baghdad paid that price willingly, without complaint. So smoke lingered. It drifted. It stayed just long enough to matter, and in doing so, it became a companion rather than an enemy. Not something to defeat, but something to live alongside. The city did not sleep in perfect darkness or perfect air. It slept in conditions that felt known, familiar, and sufficient. Baghdad accepted smoke because it accepted reality. And reality here was not meant to be flawless. It was meant to be survivable. Smoke became something the body learned to live with rather than resist. It entered clothing, hair, wood, and stone, then quietly stopped calling attention to itself. People did not register its presence through irritation, but through familiarity. Too much smoke required adjustment. Too little felt strangely empty. The balance existed in between, barely noticed, like the steady sound of breathing in a room meant for rest. This tolerance shaped behavior without instruction. People positioned themselves where the air moved just enough. Mats were placed slightly away from the heaviest drift. Lamps were set where smoke would not smother the flame. These choices happened instinctively, learned early, repeated daily, and rarely discussed. Baghdad did not teach its inhabitants to eliminate smoke. It taught them how to share space with it. There was reassurance in that presence. Smoke meant the household was active, even if quietly so. Something had been cooked. Something had been tended. Even when voices fell and movement slowed, the faint haze suggested continuity. The house had not gone dark or cold all at once. Life had withdrawn gently, not abruptly. In this way, smoke softened transitions. It eased the shift from activity into rest. Without sharp contrasts, the body relaxed more easily. Light faded gradually. Heat settled. Nothing snapped into silence. Everything cooperated. Baghdad understood, without articulating it, that rest arrives best when nothing insists on clarity. This acceptance also reduced unease. Discomfort that is expected loses its power to disturb. Smoke was not a surprise and therefore not a threat. It was part of the arrangement. Arrangements that are understood rarely cause anxiety. Baghdad lived inside its conditions rather than fighting them. The city did not aim for ideal air. It aimed for livable air. Livable meant air that carried traces of fire, traces of work, traces of human presence. Perfect purity would have required constant correction. Baghdad preferred steadiness. Steadiness asked only for patience. By allowing smoke to remain, the city avoided a deeper restlessness. It did not chase an imagined future of flawless comfort. It stayed grounded in what could be managed with available materials and habits. This grounding kept life stable. Expectations remained realistic. The city did not exhaust itself solving problems that did not need solving. So smoke stayed, not as an intruder but as a companion. It shared the room quietly. It marked the passing of hours without comment. And when morning arrived, it thinned and disappeared without ceremony, leaving behind no drama, only the memory of warmth. Baghdad did not demand purity from its environment. It asked only for reliability. Smoke, imperfect and persistent, provided exactly that. The city contracted after sunset. Baghdad was expansive by design. By day it stretched outward with confidence. Streets carried purpose, courtyards filled with motion, districts connected loosely, trusting that movement would stitch them together. The city did not feel the need to contain itself while the light was present. Space was available and Baghdad used it. When the sun lowered, that expansiveness quietly retreated. Not all at once, not dramatically. The city did not close like a gate, it folded like fabric. What had been wide became selective. What had been continuous became dotted. Baghdad did not disappear after sunset. It condensed. Only a few streets retained firelight. Not the grand avenues, but the practical ones. Paths that connected homes still in use. Corners where a task had not yet finished. These lights were not meant to guide the city. They were meant to mark presence, to say that life had not withdrawn completely. Beyond them, the streets accepted darkness without resistance. Most houses settled early, doors closed, courtyards quieted, lamps were lowered rather than extinguished. A few rooms remained active, holding conversations that did not need witnesses. In these houses, fire burned low, light stayed close to the ground, and movement was deliberate. Elsewhere, the city rested without apology. Sound changed first. The layered noise of daytime activity thinned. Footsteps became occasional rather than constant. Voices dropped away. What remained was not silence, but steadiness. The river continued its work. The Tigris moved without concern for human schedules, offering a continuous, unhurried sound that did not demand attention. It anchored the night, reminding the city that something larger than routine was still in motion. This contraction was not a sign of weakness. It was an act of coordination. Baghdad did not try to occupy every inch of itself at all hours. It understood that space does not require constant use to remain meaningful. Empty streets were not failures. They were pauses. The city trusted its own structure enough to let large portions of itself go quiet. Movement became purposeful. If someone walked, it was for a reason: to return home, to finish a task, to check on something that mattered. There was no wandering for its own sake, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt unnecessary. The city did not encourage motion simply to fill time. It allowed time to exist without being filled. This shrinking of active space made the city feel smaller, but not poorer. It felt focused. Energy gathered where it was needed and withdrew elsewhere. A handful of lit windows carried the weight of presence for entire neighborhoods. A few occupied rooms represented continuity for blocks that otherwise rested. Baghdad did not need to be fully awake to remain alive. There is a quiet comfort in this arrangement. The body relaxes when its surroundings do not insist on engagement. Streets that do not call out, buildings that do not glow for attention. The city becomes something you are inside, not something that presses against you. Baghdad understood this intuitively. By allowing itself to contract, it gave its inhabitants permission to do the same. The silence was not empty. It was organized. It had shape. It moved around the few remaining points of activity, and then settled again. The city breathed in. What had spread outward during the day now gathered inward, conserving energy, holding form. By the time the night fully settled, Baghdad had already chosen what to keep active and what to let rest. Nothing struggled against that choice. Fires remained small. Lamps dimmed. The river continued. Most of the city lay still, not abandoned, not forgotten, simply unused for the moment. Baghdad did not need to occupy itself constantly to remain whole. It contracted after sunset because it knew how to expand again. This contraction changed how the city felt from the inside. Distance shortened, not in measurement but in relevance. Places that mattered remained close. Everything else receded politely. A person did not feel surrounded by a vast capital anymore. They felt held within a smaller, workable world. The city reduced itself to a scale the body could manage without effort. Neighborhoods became self-contained. A single lit room might represent an entire street. A quiet courtyard could hold all the presence a block required. Baghdad did not distribute life evenly across its space. It concentrated it. And concentration made the city feel calmer rather than constrained. There was no sense of abandonment in the darkened areas. Streets were not forgotten. They were simply resting. Their usefulness had a schedule, and that schedule was respected. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing demanded revival. The city trusted that what was inactive now would be active again when conditions supported it. This trust shaped expectations. People did not feel pressure to remain visible. They did not interpret quiet as absence or danger. A closed door meant completion, not withdrawal. An unlit street meant pause, not neglect. Baghdad did not dramatize emptiness. It allowed it. The river's steady movement became more noticeable as other sounds faded. Water did not fill the silence. It replaced it with something softer. The Tigris carried continuity through the contracted city, reminding it that motion did not need human participation to exist. This presence grounded the night without disturbing it. As activity narrowed, attention sharpened. Small sounds mattered more. A footstep was noticed, a door was heard. But nothing startled. The city was alert without being tense. This balance was learned through repetition, through countless evenings where nothing went wrong precisely because nothing insisted on happening. By allowing most of itself to grow quiet, Baghdad reduced friction. Fewer interactions meant fewer conflicts. Less movement meant fewer accidents. Reduced visibility meant reduced demand. The city became safer not through control but through restraint. What remains striking is how natural this felt. No one mourned the wider city while it rested. No one felt deprived by unused streets. The contraction was expected, accepted, and even appreciated. It allowed the city to carry its size without strain. Baghdad did not fear becoming smaller for a time. It knew that scale was flexible, that a city could be vast in daylight and intimate afterward without losing coherence. This flexibility was not weakness, it was intelligence. When the city finally settled into its quietest state, there was no final moment, no closing gesture. Activity simply tapered until only what mattered remained. A few lights, a few voices, the river, and beyond that a city intact enough to wait. Baghdad contracted after sunset, not because it lacked energy, but because it understood where energy belonged. And by gathering itself inward, it preserved the shape that allowed it to expand again when the light returned. Knowledge slept too. Even in Baghdad, knowledge did not stay awake forever. This is easy to forget because later memory prefers brightness. Lamps burning late. Scholars bent over pages. Words traveling endlessly through the night. But Baghdad did not preserve learning by exhausting it. It preserved learning by protecting the people who carried it. And people, even learned ones, needed rest. Oil lamps were costly, not ruinously so, but enough to matter, enough that one did not light them casually for hours without purpose. Oil had to be bought, stored, monitored. Wicks had to be trimmed. Smoke gathered. Light strained the eyes long before it illuminated the mind. Reading after dark was possible, but it was never free. Eyes tired quickly, parchment reflected light unevenly, ink blurred at the edges when attention faltered. Scholars knew this. They did not romanticize fatigue. A tired mind misreads, misunderstands, forgets. Baghdad valued accuracy more than endurance. Knowledge here was not a test of how long one could stay awake, but of how carefully one could return to the text the next day. And the next day always mattered. Teaching resumed, copying continued, debates reopened, libraries were visited again. None of this worked well if the night had been spent forcing attention beyond its natural limits. Baghdad understood that learning was cumulative. It depended on continuity, not heroic effort. Missing one evening of reading mattered less than damaging the rhythm that allowed years of work to proceed. So scholars closed books. Lamps were lowered. Notes were left unfinished without anxiety. There was no shame in stopping. Stopping was part of the method. Knowledge did not disappear because it was unattended for a few hours. It waited. This attitude shaped institutions as much as individuals. Study was not organized around relentless output. It followed the same logic as the rest of the city. Work when conditions supported clarity, rest when they did not. Baghdad did not confuse constant activity with devotion to learning. It knew better. There is something quietly ironic here. A city celebrated for preserving ancient texts did so by stepping away from them regularly. Manuscripts survived because they were not handled endlessly. Minds remained sharp because they were not pushed into dullness. Knowledge rested, and because it rested, it endured. Night, then, was not wasted time. It was protective time. It shielded scholarship from overuse. It allowed memory to settle. It gave the body permission to withdraw, so the mind could return intact. Baghdad did not demand that learning prove itself every hour. It trusted that what mattered would still matter after sleep. This trust extended beyond scholars. Teachers, scribes, students, all participated in the same rhythm. Lamps dimmed across the city not because curiosity vanished, but because tomorrow promised better conditions. Knowledge did not need to rush. It had already decided to stay. In this way, Baghdad teaches a quiet lesson. Learning does not thrive on defiance of the body. It thrives on cooperation with it. Books are not preserved by sleeplessness. They are preserved by people who know when to close them. So knowledge slept too, not as a failure of ambition, but as an act of care. Baghdad allowed wisdom to rest, confident that it would wake again, unchanged, ready to continue where it had paused. This habit shaped how knowledge lived inside the city. Learning was not something that hovered above daily life. It was embedded within it, subject to the same limits as cooking, walking, and speaking. A scholar in Baghdad was not expected to be awake longer than a baker or a merchant. Wisdom did not excuse the body from fatigue. It depended on the body remaining intact. Rooms of study reflected this understanding. They were not designed for endless hours of illumination. Lamps were placed carefully, close enough to the page to be useful, far enough to avoid strain. When the light no longer served clarity, it was not forced to continue. Pages were marked, texts were closed. There was no drama in stopping. Ending work was as normal as beginning it. This created a different relationship with time. Knowledge was not chased, it was revisited. Ideas were allowed to sit overnight without resolution. Questions remained unanswered until the next day without anxiety. Baghdad did not require intellectual closure at all costs. It accepted that understanding deepens when allowed to pause. There was also an unspoken respect for memory. Sleep was understood as part of learning, not an interruption of it. The mind reorganized what it had taken in. Connections formed quietly. What seemed unclear at night often felt obvious in the morning. Baghdad trusted this process long before it needed to explain it. The city's scholars were not admired for how long they stayed awake, but for how long they stayed consistent. Years mattered more than nights. A lifetime of careful study outweighed any single display of endurance. Knowledge here was not theatrical. It was durable. This approach protected texts as well. Manuscripts were fragile, ink faded, pages wore thin. Handling them endlessly under poor light invited damage. By closing books when conditions worsened, Baghdad extended their lives. Preservation was not achieved through constant use, but through respectful restraint. Even conversation followed this rhythm. Discussions ended when voices tired. Arguments paused before tempers frayed. Debate resumed later, often improved by distance. The city did not imagine that truth required immediacy. It allowed thought to breathe. In this way, knowledge became something shared with the body rather than imposed upon it. Learning moved at a human pace. It rose with daylight and settled with fatigue. Baghdad did not fear that wisdom would escape during rest. It understood that wisdom, like the city itself, survives by returning. So when lamps dimmed across Baghdad, knowledge dimmed with them, not disappearing, only waiting. Books rested on shelves. Minds loosened their grip. The city trusted that tomorrow would bring light again, and with it, the clarity required to continue. Knowledge slept too because Baghdad knew that what truly lasts does not demand wakefulness at all costs. It asks only for care, patience, and the discipline to stop at the right moment. The night belonged to habit, not genius. Nothing revolutionary happened at midnight in Baghdad. No sudden insight demanded a lamp be relit. No great invention insisted on interrupting rest. The city did not believe that brilliance arrived only when sleep was denied. What arrived instead were habits. Doors were closed because they always had been. Fires were lowered because that was the sensible thing to do. People slept closer together, not out of fear, but out of efficiency. These actions were not debated. They were not improved upon every evening. They were repeated. And repetition, in Baghdad, mattered more than inspiration. This is where many modern imaginations struggle. We like to picture history as a sequence of breakthroughs, moments when someone stayed awake longer than everyone else and changed the world before dawn. Baghdad offers a quieter model. It suggests that most of what endures is not born from genius, but from routines that work well enough to be left alone. At night, Baghdad did not ask its people to be clever. It asked them to be consistent. The closing of doors was the first act in this nightly sequence. Not slammed, not locked with anxiety, simply closed. The city did not require dramatic separation from the outside. A door closed meant that what needed to be done had been done. The boundary was clear. Inside and outside were no longer in conversation. This was not withdrawal. It was completion. Fire followed. Flames were lowered deliberately, not extinguished unless necessary. A reduced fire did not invite activity. It discouraged it gently. The heat softened. The light shortened. The room shifted from doing to being. No one announced this shift. It was understood. The body recognized the signal immediately. Sleeping arrangements reflected the same logic. People slept closer together not because they lacked space, but because proximity conserved warmth and effort. Empty space was not something to be admired at night. It was something that required resources to maintain. Sharing heat was easier. Sharing silence was easier. Sleep arrived faster when the body did not feel exposed to unnecessary distance. These habits were not romantic. They were not framed as cultural values in any explicit way. They were simply how things were done. And because they were done the same way repeatedly, they shaped the city more reliably than any moment of inspiration could have. Baghdad understood something fundamental. Inspiration is expensive. It demands attention, energy, and often disruption. Habit, by contrast, is economical. It costs very little once established. It runs quietly. It does not require constant justification. For a city as large and complex as Baghdad, habit was the only scalable solution. Nighttime made this clear. During the day, variation could be tolerated. Different routes, different tasks, different conversations. At night, variation was costly. A single deviation demanded extra fuel, extra light, extra vigilance. Baghdad minimized deviation, not through enforcement, but through expectation. People did what they had always done because it worked. This repetition created a sense of ease. The city did not feel tense at night. It felt settled. Everyone knew what came next. There was no need to decide again whether to stay awake, whether to keep working, whether to wander. The decision had already been made by generations before. That inheritance relieved the present of unnecessary choice. There is a subtle humor in this. Baghdad, so often celebrated for its intellectual achievements, relied deeply on unthinking behavior to function smoothly. The city did not operate by constant cleverness. It operated by reducing the need for cleverness wherever possible. Intelligence was reserved for moments that required it. Night did not. Even those inclined toward innovation understood this boundary. Creativity had its hours. Night was not one of them. Forcing ideas after fatigue rarely produced anything worth keeping. Baghdad's thinkers knew when the mind had crossed from productive curiosity into diminishing returns. They stopped, not because they lacked ambition, but because they valued outcomes over effort. The city itself modeled this restraint. Streets did not encourage exploration after dark. Layouts that facilitated movement by day became discouraging to navigate without light. This was not accidental, it was a feature. The environment gently reinforced the habit of staying put. Baghdad did not trap its people indoors. It simply made remaining where you were the most reasonable choice. Habit also protected the city from chaos. When behavior is predictable, systems remain stable. Fires are less likely to spread. Conflicts are less likely to arise. Accidents become rare. Night in Baghdad was not policed heavily because it did not need to be. Most people were already doing what minimized risk. This predictability extended across social boundaries. Rich and poor, scholar and laborer, household and institution all followed similar rhythms. Differences existed, of course, but the basic sequence remained intact. Doors closed. Fires lowered. Bodies rested. This shared pattern created cohesion without requiring coordination. There is something deeply calming about a city that does not expect originality at every moment. Baghdad did not ask its people to reinvent their evenings. It allowed them to inhabit them. Habit freed attention for rest. It removed pressure. It made night something to pass through, not something to conquer. The absence of invention at night did not signal stagnation. It signaled trust. Trust that progress did not require constant novelty. Trust that tomorrow would provide opportunities again. Trust that the world would not fall apart if nothing remarkable happened between sunset and sunrise. Baghdad's endurance depended on this trust. A city that exhausts itself chasing inspiration eventually runs out of energy to maintain its foundations. Baghdad protected its foundations by placing routine above excitement. It understood that the extraordinary depends on the ordinary functioning reliably. Sleep itself became part of this habit, not romanticized, not idealized, simply expected. People slept because sleep was necessary, not because it was virtuous. The city did not celebrate rest. It scheduled around it. That distinction mattered. Rest was not an achievement. It was maintenance. This attitude prevented guilt. No one lay awake worrying that they should be doing something more. The night did not demand productivity. It offered permission to stop. And permission, when granted consistently, creates calm. Even dreams, if they occurred, belonged to the individual, not the city. Baghdad did not harvest them for meaning. It did not expect insight to emerge fully formed from sleep. What mattered was that the body recovered, the mind reset, and the habit held. The repetition of these nights accumulated quietly. Thousands of evenings, each unremarkable on its own, formed a pattern strong enough to support centuries. This is how Baghdad functioned, not through flashes of brilliance after midnight, but through evenings that looked very much like the ones before. There is a temptation to dismiss this as dull, but dullness is a modern insult. In Baghdad, it would have sounded like praise. Dull nights meant stable days. Predictable evenings meant energy preserved for work that mattered. Habit was not the enemy of creativity. It was its condition. The city did not confuse rest with laziness. It did not confuse excitement with progress. It distinguished carefully between what felt impressive and what actually sustained life. That distinction allowed Baghdad to remain functional long after more dramatic places burned themselves out. So the night belonged to habit, to doors closed gently, to fires reduced thoughtfully, to bodies arranged efficiently. Nothing here sought attention, nothing asked to be remembered. And because of that, everything necessary continued. Baghdad did not rely on genius to survive the night. Genius, like fire, was used sparingly and at appropriate times. Habit did the rest. Quietly, reliably, without asking for credit. And when morning arrived, it arrived to a city that had not been depleted by its own ambition. A city that had slept through nothing important because what mattered most had been taken care of already. That is how Baghdad endured. Not by brilliance in the dark, but by repetition in the quiet. This reliance on habit gave Baghdad a particular kind of confidence. The city did not need to test itself every night to prove that it was still capable. It already knew. Its systems were not held together by brilliance, but by familiarity. When actions are repeated often enough, they stop requiring attention. And when attention is no longer consumed by basic functioning, a city becomes calmer. Habit reduced choice, and reduced choice reduced strain. People did not lie awake debating whether to stay up longer, whether to keep a fire burning, whether to leave the house again. Those questions had answers long before they were asked. The answers were built into the rhythm of life itself. This removed friction from evenings. It allowed rest to arrive without negotiation. There is a quiet relief in not having to decide. Baghdad offered that relief generously. Night was not a time for experimentation. It was a time for continuation. The same sequence unfolded again and again, not because no one imagined alternatives, but because alternatives offered no advantage. Habit had already proven itself reliable. This reliability shaped emotional life as well. Anxiety thrives in uncertainty, not in repetition. When evenings behave predictably, the body relaxes more easily. The city did not surprise its inhabitants at night. It reassured them through sameness. The streets did what they always did. Houses behaved as expected. Nothing demanded adaptation at a moment when adaptation would be costly. Even misfortune was softened by this structure. When something went wrong, it stood out clearly against the background of routine. A sound where there should be none, a light where darkness usually settled. Habit made disruption visible quickly without panic. The city did not need constant alertness to remain safe. Its patterns did the work quietly. What is striking is how little ego is involved in this system. Habit does not care who performs it. It works regardless of individual brilliance. Baghdad could function smoothly, without requiring every person to be exceptional. This inclusivity made endurance possible. A city that depends on genius alone is fragile. A city that depends on habit can survive ordinary people having ordinary days. Night, then, was not the stage for greatness. It was the foundation for it. By refusing to demand inspiration after dark, Baghdad protected the conditions that allowed inspiration to emerge later. Daylight belonged to effort. Night belonged to maintenance. Both were necessary, but they did not compete. This separation of roles kept the city balanced. No hour was asked to do more than it could. No part of the day was burdened with proving the city's worth. Baghdad did not exhaust itself seeking meaning in every moment. It trusted accumulation. Small, repeated actions, carried out consistently, would be enough. And they were. The nights passed without invention, without revelation, without drama. Doors closed, fires dimmed, bodies gathered, sleep arrived. Nothing new was created. Nothing important was lost. The city remained intact. That was the achievement. Baghdad endured because it did not ask the night to be brilliant. It asked it to be familiar. And familiarity, practiced carefully, turned out to be far more powerful than genius ever could. Fire was a signal, not a beacon. In Baghdad, fire did not try to explain the city. It did not attempt to outline streets, define districts, or declare importance. It did not stand high or spread far. A fire here did only one thing, and it did it quietly. It said, "Someone is here." That was enough. A single small flame was never meant to illuminate Baghdad. The city was far too large for that, and no one expected otherwise. Fire did not compete with darkness. It negotiated with it. It carved out a modest pocket of presence and stopped there. Beyond that pocket, the city was allowed to remain what it was, vast, indistinct, and mostly unseen. This is where Baghdad begins to resemble a painting rather than a map, not a diagram of streets and functions, but a wide canvas where most of the surface is dark and meaning appears only in scattered points. A few lit windows, a low glow behind a door, a faint flicker that suggests life without describing it. The rest is left intentionally unfinished. In this painting, fire is not the subject. It is a brush stroke, small, precise, placed only where needed. A beacon announces itself. It demands attention. It tells others where to go, what to see, how to orient themselves. Baghdad had little use for such insistence. A beacon would have implied invitation, movement, gathering. Night was not for gathering. Night was for staying. So fires stayed small enough to reassure those nearby without summoning anyone else. This restraint changed how the city felt from afar. From above, if such a view had been possible, Baghdad would not have looked alive in the way modern cities do. There would have been no grid of light, no uniform glow. Instead, there would have been dots, uneven, irregular, quiet, a constellation rather than a pattern. presence without proclamation. Each flame marked a household, not a neighborhood. It spoke inward, not outward. It told those inside that they were not alone in the dark. It told those nearby that life continued somewhere close, even if unseen. It did not attempt to speak to the entire city. Baghdad did not require that kind of reassurance. This also meant that darkness retained its authority. Streets remained dark not because the city had failed to light them, but because they were not meant to be used. Darkness was not the absence of care. It was the presence of intention. Light was placed where it mattered and withheld where it did not. In this way, the city avoided visual noise. Nothing competed for attention. The eye was not pulled in multiple directions. A single flame could hold focus without distraction. This calm visual environment made rest easier. The body was not tempted to remain alert by unnecessary brightness. Baghdad did not stimulate itself at night. It soothed itself. Fire as a signal also carried social meaning. A lit flame suggested occupation, not availability. It did not say come in, it said someone remains. That distinction mattered. Presence did not imply openness. The city respected boundaries. Light did not erase them. There is a quiet confidence in this arrangement. Baghdad did not need to announce its scale. It did not need to display its population. It trusted that existence did not require visibility at all times. A city could remain real even when most of it was unseen. Seen this way, Baghdad truly becomes a painting, a dark field with careful points of warmth. Nothing excessive, nothing missing, each flame placed with restraint, each shadow allowed to remain. Meaning emerges not from what is shown, but from what is deliberately left quiet. Fire did not try to dominate the canvas. It simply marked where life continued. And that was all the city asked of it. Because fire was only a signal, not a beacon, it changed how people understood visibility. To be seen was not a requirement. To be present was enough. A household did not need to announce itself to the city. It only needed to reassure itself that it had not slipped entirely into absence. The small flame did not perform. It confirmed. This made Baghdad feel less exposed. In cities where light spreads widely, every space is forced into participation. Here, most of the city was allowed to remain unobserved. Darkness protected scale. It softened edges. It prevented the mind from grasping everything at once. Baghdad did not overwhelm its inhabitants with its own size. It let them experience only what was immediately relevant. The painting analogy holds because nothing here is accidental. Darkness is not empty space. It is negative space, carefully preserved. The eye is guided not by brightness, but by restraint. A single glow carries meaning precisely because it is rare. If everything were lit, nothing would matter. Baghdad understood this instinctively. These small fires also shaped movement without commanding it. A person walking through the city did not follow light like a moth. They navigated by memory, by familiarity, by the quiet confidence that came from knowing where they were going. Fire did not lead. It accompanied. It stayed where it was placed and asked nothing more. There was also a shared understanding that fire did not imply invitation. A light behind a wall did not mean a door would open. It meant only that someone inside had chosen not to vanish completely into darkness. This preserved privacy. The city remained social without becoming porous. Boundaries stayed intact even as presence was acknowledged. In this way, Baghdad avoided turning itself into a spectacle. It did not perform urban life at night. It simply maintained it. The city did not need to reassure itself with brightness. It trusted continuity over display. A few flames were enough to confirm that life was still distributed across the city, even if most of it could not be seen. The river again fit naturally into this composition. Its surface reflected occasional points of light, stretching them briefly, then dissolving them again. The Tigris did not amplify illumination. It softened it. Light touched water and then disappeared. The effect was calming rather than dramatic. Nothing lingered too long. This visual modesty helped the body relax. The eyes were not overstimulated. The mind was not asked to process constant input. Darkness did not feel threatening when it was punctuated gently rather than challenged aggressively. Baghdad allowed night to remain night, with just enough signal to prevent disorientation. There is something deeply intentional in a city that chooses not to reveal itself fully. Baghdad did not equate visibility with safety or success. It equated excess visibility with waste. Light consumed fuel. Fuel required effort. Effort was not spent unless it served a purpose. Signaling presence served a purpose. Broadcasting it did not. So the city remained a quiet constellation. Points of warmth scattered across a dark field. No central blaze, no dominant glow, each flame independent, each household self-contained. Together they formed a living image, not through coordination, but through shared understanding. When viewed as a whole, Baghdad did not shine, it breathed. Its life was not declared loudly, it was implied. Fire did not attempt to master the darkness, it simply ensured that no one felt entirely erased by it, and that in the end was enough. The city did not need to be seen to exist. It only needed to leave a trace. Security came from stillness. In Baghdad, safety did not arrive with brightness or noise. It did not depend on constant movement or visible vigilance. The city did not guard itself by announcing that it was alert. It did something quieter. It became still. At night, movement decreased, not because people were afraid, but because there was little reason to move. Tasks had been completed. Destinations had been reached. Streets did not invite wandering, and no one felt obligated to accept an invitation that was never offered. Fewer footsteps meant fewer collisions. Fewer encounters meant fewer misunderstandings. The city reduced friction simply by allowing itself to slow down. Light followed the same logic. Darkness was not treated as a vulnerability to be corrected. It was treated as a condition that reduced attention. And reduced attention in a city of this scale was protective. When nothing stood out, nothing demanded response. When no space competed for notice, most spaces were left alone. Baghdad understood that attention attracts as much as it deters. This is the part that feels counterintuitive to later sensibilities. We tend to associate safety with visibility, with patrols, with illumination, with proof that someone is watching. Baghdad practiced a different form of security. It relied on the absence of provocation. It trusted that a city not advertising its activity would encounter fewer reasons for disruption. Stillness made intentions legible. When someone moved at night, the movement was noticeable without being alarming. It stood out gently against a background of quiet. There was no chaos to hide within, no noise to mask purpose. This clarity did not require constant observation. It emerged naturally from restraint. The city's architecture supported this. Narrow passages did not encourage speed. Courtyards enclosed sound. Walls absorbed rather than amplified. Baghdad did not echo loudly at night. It softened everything it touched. A raised voice was immediately obvious. A hurried step felt out of place. The environment itself discouraged excess. This did not mean that the city was unguarded. It meant that guarding was distributed rather than concentrated. Every household participated by withdrawing. Every closed door reduced exposure. Every unlit street reduced temptation. Security was not assigned to a single institution. It was embedded in behavior. There is a subtle confidence in this approach. Baghdad did not try to look strong. It trusted that strength did not need display. A city constantly demonstrating its defenses often reveals its anxiety. Baghdad revealed composure instead. Composure, when shared widely, creates stability. This stability allowed people to rest without tension. They did not lie awake listening for threats. They listened to the river. They listened to familiar sounds within their homes. The absence of disturbance became normal. Normality repeated becomes assurance. Even those responsible for order benefited from this stillness. Fewer disturbances meant fewer interventions. Fewer interventions meant less escalation. The city avoided spirals of attention by not creating situations that demanded it. Baghdad did not challenge the night, it aligned with it. Light, when present, remained contained. A lamp behind a wall did not spill into the street. It did not invite approach. It reassured those inside without advertising their presence. This restraint protected privacy, and privacy protected safety. The city did not confuse openness with security. It valued discretion. The reduction of movement also reduced mistakes. Accidents are often the result of haste. At night, Baghdad discouraged haste by removing incentives for it. There was nowhere urgent to be, nothing pressing to be done. When urgency disappears, error follows. This atmosphere also shaped social expectations. People did not interpret quiet as abandonment. They did not assume danger in darkness. They assumed rest. A closed door was not suspicious. It was courteous. An unlit street was not neglected. It was complete for the moment. Baghdad's safety was therefore not dramatic. It did not hinge on confrontation. It emerged from alignment. The city and its inhabitants shared an understanding that restraint reduced risk more effectively than vigilance ever could. When nothing insisted on happening, little went wrong. There is a gentle irony here. By refusing to appear safe in obvious ways, Baghdad became safer. By not drawing attention to itself, it avoided attention. By not remaining active, it reduced opportunity. Security came not from asserting control, but from removing reasons to test it. This approach also preserved energy. Constant alertness is exhausting. Baghdad did not exhaust itself guarding against possibilities that rarely materialized. It conserved effort for moments that required it. Stillness was not passivity. It was strategic patience. As the night deepened, the city settled further. Sounds thinned, light receded, movement became rare. Nothing about this felt tense, it felt resolved. Baghdad did not hold its breath. It exhaled, and in that exhale, the city remained intact. Baghdad was safest when it did not try to look safe. It trusted stillness to do what force could not. It trusted quiet to carry the night, and night treated with respect rather than resistance passed without incident. This stillness also reshaped how people understood responsibility. Security was not something delivered from above. It emerged from collective behavior. Each person who chose not to wander, not to light unnecessarily, not to draw attention, contributed to the calm that protected everyone else. Baghdad did not outsource safety entirely. It distributed it quietly across its habits. The city became difficult to read from the outside, and that unreadability was a form of strength. Without constant signals, there was little to interpret. Without interpretation, there was less temptation. A place that does not advertise its rhythms is harder to disrupt. Baghdad learned this without needing to articulate it. It simply behaved in ways that reduced exposure. Even fear behaved differently here. It did not sharpen into alertness. It softened into caution. People were not on edge. They were settled. The absence of stimulation allowed the nervous system to relax. A calm population makes fewer errors. Fewer errors mean fewer incidents. The city benefited from this chain of effects night after night. Stillness also preserved dignity. No one was forced into visibility to prove they belonged. No one needed to perform safety for others. The city respected privacy as a form of order. When boundaries are honored, conflict has little room to grow. Baghdad maintained peace by leaving space where confrontation might otherwise appear. There is a quiet maturity in this arrangement. Baghdad did not imagine that safety could be engineered perfectly. It accepted uncertainty, then minimized it through restraint. It did not attempt to eliminate risk. It reduced opportunity. That distinction allowed the city to function without tension. As the night moved forward, nothing pressed against the stillness. It held. Doors remained closed. Lights stayed low. Movement stayed rare. The city did not wait anxiously for morning. It trusted the hours to pass on their own, and they did. When daylight eventually returned, it did not find a city exhausted from vigilance. It found one that had rested. Systems resumed smoothly because they had not been strained. People rose without the residue of alertness clinging to them. The night had done its work by doing very little at all. Baghdad did not protect itself through force or display. It protected itself through agreement. An agreement, repeated nightly, that calm was safer than noise, that darkness was less risky than glare, and that stillness, when shared, was stronger than any show of control. That is how the city endured, not by standing guard against the night, but by settling into it, confident that nothing needed to happen for everything to remain intact. What made this system endure was that it never felt imposed. Stillness was not enforced through fear or command. It emerged naturally from shared understanding. People did not withdraw at night because they were told to. They did so because nothing encouraged them to remain visible. The city did not push them inward. It simply stopped pulling them outward. This absence of pressure mattered. A place that demands constant alertness teaches its inhabitants to expect trouble. Baghdad did the opposite. By allowing the city to quiet itself, it taught people that calm was normal. When calm becomes normal, disturbances stand out clearly and briefly without panic. Security does not require constant tension when the environment itself discourages disruption. Baghdad's stillness also reduced the need for authority to intervene. Fewer movements meant fewer encounters. Fewer encounters meant fewer conflicts. When disagreements did arise, they were isolated rather than contagious. The city did not generate momentum toward disorder. It absorbed it. There is a kind of confidence in a city that can afford to be unremarkable at night. Baghdad did not shine to prove its safety. It did not patrol loudly to reassure itself. It trusted its own rhythms. This trust was not naive. It was built on generations of observing what actually worked. Brightness attracted attention. Noise multiplied uncertainty. Motion created opportunity. Stillness dissolved all three. The city's design reinforced this lesson gently. Streets that were generous during the day offered no reward for speed after dark. Courtyards enclosed sound. Walls broke lines of sight. Nothing invited spectacle. Even those who might have wished to test the city found little to respond to. Baghdad did not provoke. And because it did not provoke, it rarely needed to respond. By the time the night reached its deepest point, the city felt settled rather than guarded. There was no sense of holding breath. No feeling of waiting for danger to pass. The hours moved forward on their own, carried by the same quiet logic that had shaped the evening. The city remained present, without effort. When morning returned, it arrived to a place that had not been worn thin by vigilance. Systems resumed without friction. People stepped back into daylight without the residue of anxiety clinging to them. The night had preserved energy rather than consumed it. Baghdad's security did not come from watching everything. It came from allowing most things to rest. It came from understanding that a city does not need to look safe to be safe. It needs to behave in ways that leave little room for disruption. Stillness was not absence. It was arrangement. And in that arrangement, Baghdad found a form of safety so quiet that it rarely needed to be named. The capital did not rest. It paused. Baghdad did not fall asleep in the way a body does. It did not surrender fully. It did not drift away. It paused. This pause was not empty. It was deliberate, practiced, and deeply familiar. The city did not shut itself down. It reduced its speed. Breath slowed. Flames shortened. Sounds thinned until they were no longer competing with one another. What remained was not silence, but space. In that space, Baghdad held itself together. The pause began gently. Nothing marked its arrival. No signal announced that the city had entered a different state. It happened through accumulation, fewer footsteps, shorter conversations, fires lowered almost without thought, lamps dimmed until they illuminated only what was close enough to matter. The city did not declare an ending. It simply stopped adding new effort. This distinction matters. A city that rests completely risks losing continuity. A city that pauses preserves it. Baghdad understood this intuitively. Some systems continued at low intensity. Water still moved through channels. A few households remained awake. Someone somewhere was listening, tending, waiting. The city never disappeared entirely. It remained lightly present, like a hand resting on a table rather than gripping it. Breathing changed first, not just human breathing, but the rhythm of the city itself. The pace of movement slowed. The intervals between sounds lengthened. The city did not hold its breath. It exhaled. That exhale carried with it the tension of the day and released it gradually, without urgency. Fire mirrored this behavior. Flames did not go out suddenly, unless there was reason. They were reduced, coaxed into embers that could persist without attention. A smaller fire consumed less fuel and asked for less vigilance. It stayed warm enough to reassure, and then quietly withdrew from importance. Fire, like the city, learned how to pause without vanishing. Sound followed. The layered noise of daytime life dissolved into something sparse and readable, a door closing, a voice fading, the river continuing its steady movement, unchanged by human schedules. These sounds did not interrupt rest. They supported it. They reminded the city that continuity did not require constant activity. Baghdad's pause was not an accident of fatigue. It was a method of preservation. The city understood that energy spent unnecessarily could not be recovered easily. By slowing rather than stopping, it conserved what mattered. Attention was not scattered. Resources were not wasted. Bodies were not strained. The city carried itself lightly through the hours that demanded the least from it. This approach shaped expectations. No one felt compelled to remain alert for its own sake. No one feared missing something essential. The pause reassured rather than unsettled. It told the city that nothing urgent was expected right now, and that permission mattered. Even governance participated in this rhythm. Authority did not hover restlessly. Decisions waited. Systems trusted themselves to resume. Power did not fear absence. It understood that presence, when constant, loses meaning. By stepping back, the city preserved clarity for when it would be needed again. The pause also protected memory. Days flowed into one another without rupture. What was unfinished remained unfinished without anxiety. Tasks paused did not threaten collapse. Baghdad trusted that continuation was more powerful than completion forced at the wrong moment. There is a quiet elegance in a capital that knows how to pause. It does not confuse activity with importance. It does not demand performance from every hour. It allows time to be uneven. Some hours carry weight, others carry recovery. Both are necessary. As the night deepened, Baghdad did not disappear into darkness. It held a faint outline of itself. A few lights, a few sounds, a sense of form without detail. The city remained legible to those who belonged to it without making itself legible to everything else. This pause kept the city intact. It prevented exhaustion, it prevented error, it prevented the slow erosion that comes from constant effort. By pausing, Baghdad kept its edges from fraying. It arrived at morning not depleted but ready. When daylight returned, it did not wake a city from sleep. It resumed a city that had been waiting. Systems expanded smoothly, movement increased without friction, fire grew where it was needed, sound layered itself back into complexity. Nothing needed to be repaired because nothing had been strained. Baghdad did not rest deeply. It paused carefully, and in that pause, it kept enough of itself intact to become fully present again when the day asked for it. This pause gave Baghdad a particular resilience. The city did not rely on constant momentum to define itself. It did not fear losing coherence if it slowed. Instead, it trusted that what had been built carefully would hold even when attention withdrew. Walls remained walls. Streets remained streets. Institutions remained intact without needing to be reminded of their purpose every hour. People felt this stability in their bodies. There was no rush to be elsewhere, no anxiety about falling behind. The city did not punish stillness, it supported it. When effort paused, nothing collapsed. That knowledge allowed rest to arrive naturally without resistance. Rest was not an interruption. It was part of the system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The pause also softened transitions. There was no sharp boundary between activity and rest. The city did not snap from motion into silence. It eased. Each small reduction prepared the next. Fire dimmed before light vanished. Sound thinned before quiet settled. Movement slowed before stopping altogether. This gradualness mattered. It allowed the body to follow, without friction. Baghdad's pause was shared, and that sharing made it effective. When everyone reduced effort together, no one felt left behind. The city moved as a single organism, not through coordination, but through habit. This collective slowing prevented imbalance. No one was carrying the weight of the city alone while others rested. Energy was conserved evenly. There is something deeply practical about this. A capital that pauses together avoids hidden exhaustion. It avoids the slow accumulation of strain that eventually demands repair. Baghdad did not wait for failure to justify rest. It built rest into its rhythm from the beginning. This is why the pause never felt empty. It felt held. A city that pauses without trust becomes anxious. Baghdad paused with confidence. Confidence that nothing essential would be lost. Confidence that the hours of low demand were not a threat, but an opportunity to preserve strength. Even time itself seemed to behave differently during this pause. Hours passed without urgency. Nothing insisted on being completed. The city allowed itself to exist without progress for a while, and existence, unburdened by expectation, became gentle. As the pause deepened, Baghdad did not disappear. It remained faintly present, like a shape felt in the dark, rather than seen. Enough remained to orient those who were awake. Enough remained to reassure those who were not. The city did not abandon itself. It held its place quietly. When the first signs of morning approached, they did not arrive to wake the city. They arrived to meet it. Baghdad was already there, intact, composed, prepared to expand again. The pause released smoothly. No systems jolted. No habits needed repair. Everything resumed because nothing had been broken. This was Baghdad's quiet mastery, not the ability to remain active endlessly, but the ability to stop without harm, to slow without fear, to pause without vanishing. The capital did not rest as an escape. It paused as a strategy. And that strategy carried it, day after day, through centuries that demanded endurance more than brilliance. In this paused state, Baghdad was neither absent nor fully awake. It existed in between, where effort was minimal and awareness remained intact. The city did not retreat from itself. It simply loosened its grip. Nothing strained. Nothing demanded response. The capital allowed time to pass without insisting that it be used. This in-between state was where endurance lived, not in moments of brilliance or command, but in the quiet agreement that not every hour needed to carry weight. Baghdad did not waste energy proving that it was still powerful. Power here was assumed, not performed. The city trusted its own continuity enough to stop moving for a while. The pause also carried a kind of humility. Baghdad did not imagine itself larger than the cycles it depended on. Day and night were not obstacles to overcome, but conditions to work within. By pausing, the city acknowledged that even capitals are subject to rhythm. That recognition kept it flexible rather than brittle. People felt this humility as relief. The city did not ask them to carry it through the night. It asked them to set it down carefully and pick it up again later. That shared act of setting down prevented fatigue from accumulating unnoticed. Rest was not hidden. It was visible in the quiet. Nothing about the pause felt dramatic. There were no final gestures, no symbolic extinguishing of light. Things simply reduced themselves to what was necessary. A few embers, a few sounds, a sense of form held gently in place. Baghdad did not close its eyes. It lowered them. When the pause finally gave way, it did so without resistance. Morning did not break the city open. It unfolded it. The capital expanded again along familiar lines. Fire grew where needed. Sound layered itself back into complexity. Movement resumed without friction. The pause had done its work. Baghdad did not survive by refusing rest. It survived by knowing exactly how much to stop. The capital did not sleep deeply. It paused deliberately, carefully, and without fear. And in that pause, it saved enough of itself to continue. Survival was urban, not heroic. No one in Baghdad fought the night. No one stood against darkness as if it were an enemy to be defeated. There were no victories to claim, no courage to display, no stories worth carving into stone about surviving until morning. What existed instead was something quieter and far more effective. Survival in Baghdad was urban. It belonged to systems, habits, and shared restraint. It was not heroic because it did not require heroism. The city did not ask its people to endure extremes. It asked them to avoid unnecessary ones. Darkness arrived each day without drama, and Baghdad did not respond with defiance. It did not attempt to conquer the night with light or noise or movement. It adjusted, it reduced, it conserved. The city understood that energy spent proving strength was energy not available for tomorrow. This understanding shaped behavior deeply. People did not stay awake longer than needed. They did not walk farther than necessary. They did not burn more fuel than a task required. These were not sacrifices. They were efficiencies. Baghdad did not frame restraint as loss. It framed it as good sense. There was no individual triumph in this process. No single person could claim responsibility for the city's endurance, and that was precisely the point. Survival was distributed. Each small decision contributed a fraction. Together, those fractions added up to stability. This is what makes Baghdad difficult to romanticize and easy to misunderstand. There are no moments of dramatic resistance here. No lone figures holding back the dark. The city survives because no one wastes effort pretending the dark can be defeated. Darkness is simply accommodated. Urban survival depends on agreement rather than bravery. Agreement that rest is not weakness. Agreement that visibility is not always safety. Agreement that nothing essential is gained by pushing past reasonable limits. Baghdad held these agreements quietly, without slogans or declarations. The city did not test itself unnecessarily. It did not flirt with exhaustion to prove resilience. It protected itself by staying within bounds. That choice, repeated night after night, allowed Baghdad to remain functional when other places fractured under the weight of their own ambition. There is a faint irony here. Heroic survival stories tend to end quickly. Urban survival stories tend to last. Baghdad did not survive because of exceptional nights. It survived because most nights were unremarkable. Ordinary evenings did not drain the city. They preserved it. People learned to measure effort carefully, to stop before fatigue turned into error, to recognize that not every moment required response. This restraint made the city forgiving. Mistakes were rare because systems were not strained. Crises were limited because resources were not exhausted preemptively. In Baghdad, survival was not about courage under pressure. It was about refusing pressure when it was unnecessary. The city avoided danger not by confronting it, but by reducing opportunity. Less movement meant fewer conflicts. Less light meant less attention. Less noise meant fewer disruptions. These were not defensive maneuvers. They were structural choices. This approach also removed fear from daily life. When survival is built into routine, it does not need to be performed emotionally. People did not lie awake proving their resilience. They trusted the city to hold them, just as they held it through habit. Baghdad teaches a subtle lesson. Endurance is not always loud. Often it is quiet enough to be mistaken for inactivity. But inactivity is not the same as carelessness. This city was careful in a way that did not draw attention to itself. No one conquered the night in Baghdad. No one needed to. The city survived by learning when not to act, by understanding that the most effective response to darkness is not resistance but restraint, by conserving energy rather than spending it to feel powerful. Survival here was not a story of heroes. It was a story of a city that knew how not to waste itself. This kind of survival rarely leaves monuments. There are no statues to restraint, no songs written for people who chose to stop early, to dim a lamp to stay close to home. And yet these choices held Baghdad together more reliably than any moment of bravery ever could. The city endured not because someone stood taller, but because most people chose to bend slightly. Urban survival works this way. It depends on coordination without command, on shared understanding rather than individual action. Baghdad did not require heroism because heroism is unpredictable. It spikes and fades. It cannot be planned. Habit, by contrast, can be repeated. It can be taught. It can be inherited. And inheritance is what cities rely on. The night did not need to be challenged because it did not threaten the city's identity. Darkness was not an adversary. It was a condition. Baghdad learned early that conditions cannot be defeated, only managed. The city chose management. It chose to arrange life so that darkness removed as little as possible. This arrangement made courage unnecessary. No one was asked to endure discomfort alone. No one was required to prove resilience in isolation. The city absorbed risk collectively. When effort was reduced everywhere, no one place became vulnerable. When movement slowed across the city, no one path invited trouble. Safety emerged not from vigilance, but from alignment. There is a gentleness in this form of endurance. It does not exhaust people emotionally. It does not rely on fear or pride. It becomes part of the background, like breathing. People survive without thinking of themselves as survivors. They live inside a structure that quietly does the work for them. Baghdad did not celebrate survival because celebration implies uncertainty. It behaved as if survival were expected. And expectations, when shared widely, shape reality. The city trusted itself to last, and that trust shaped behavior in ways that made lasting possible. Even memory treats this kind of survival differently. There are fewer stories to tell. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet the city remained. Day followed night. Night followed day. Systems continued. People returned to work. Knowledge resumed. Trade reopened. Life unfolded without interruption. This is the success that rarely announces itself. Baghdad survived because it did not confuse effort with effectiveness. It did not mistake action for necessity. It learned to reserve its strength for moments that demanded it and to let everything else pass quietly. Urban survival is not heroic because it does not need to be. It is steady, it is shared, it is quiet enough to be overlooked, and it is precisely this quiet that allows a city to remain whole when louder strategies fail. No one fought the night. No one needed to. Baghdad survived by choosing not to spend energy proving that it could. This way of living did not feel like strategy to the people inside it. It felt like normality. When survival is woven into routine, it stops feeling urgent. It stops asking for attention. Baghdad did not teach its inhabitants how to endure hardship. It taught them how to avoid creating it in the first place. The city did not reward those who pushed themselves beyond reason. It rewarded those who returned the next day intact. Fatigue was not admired. Exhaustion was not proof of commitment. What mattered was continuity. Being present again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the one after that. Survival was measured in returns, not in resistance. This is why Baghdad never framed the night as a challenge. Challenges invite escalation. Escalation invites waste. The city chose another path. It treated the night as a low-demand interval, a span of hours, where effort could safely decrease without consequence. By lowering expectations, it lowered risk. Nothing about this required courage. It required judgment. Judgment learned early and reinforced daily. When to stop, when to dim, when to stay close. These were not decisions made in moments of fear. They were made long before fear had a chance to appear. Urban survival depends on such foresight. It is not reactive, it is preventative. Baghdad survived because it did not wait for danger to announce itself. It arranged life so that danger found little to attach to. Less movement, less attention, less strain. Each reduction removed a point of failure. There is a quiet dignity in this. The city did not dramatize its endurance. It did not demand recognition for its restraint. It simply continued. Nights passed, days resumed. Nothing needed to be recovered from because nothing had been spent recklessly. This is the survival that lasts. Not the kind that leaves scars to remember, but the kind that leaves no scars at all. A city that wakes each morning without having been damaged by the hours before. Baghdad did not survive by standing against darkness. It survived by not turning darkness into a problem. No heroes, no battles. Only a city that understood when to stop using energy that it would need again. And because of that understanding, it remained. A city that lasted by knowing when to dim. Baghdad was never great because it stayed awake. It was great because it knew when not to. This is the quiet truth that runs beneath the city's long survival. Baghdad did not measure its strength by how brightly it burned through the night, but by how carefully it reduced itself when brightness was no longer useful. Light was lowered. Fire was kept small. Movement slowed. The city did not disappear. It chose restraint. A small flame remained. A long night unfolded, and the city, vast beyond any single body, learned to carry itself without demanding too much from those inside it. Baghdad understood scale in a way that feels rare. It knew it was larger than any individual effort, and so it refused to ask individuals to compensate for that size with exhaustion. The city did not require heroism to function. It required coordination, habit, and the discipline to stop when stopping preserved more than continuing ever could. This is why the nights mattered so much, not because something dramatic happened in them, but because almost nothing did. The city contracted gently. It gathered its energy inward. It allowed darkness to exist without resistance. In doing so, it protected the systems that daylight depended on. There is something deeply modern in this, and something deeply ancient as well. Baghdad did not believe that constant activity equaled importance. It did not confuse illumination with safety or motion with vitality. It trusted that a city could remain whole even when most of it was quiet, especially then. The small fires did not try to explain the city. The dim lights did not try to display it. The stillness did not signal absence. They signaled care. Baghdad lasted because it avoided spectacle when spectacle would have cost too much. It survived because it did not drain itself, proving that it could survive. Night after night, it chose the same quiet logic. Reduce, conserve, pause, resume. And in that repetition, something remarkable happened. The city continued, not as a blaze against the dark, not as a monument to endurance, but as a living place that understood its limits and respected them. Baghdad did not outshine the night. It lived alongside it. And it is in that choice, made again and again without ceremony, that the city remained. Night after night, not louder, not brighter, but still here. And that, quietly, is the least dramatic ending Baghdad could have hoped for. No last stand, no glowing skyline, no heroic insomnia. Just a city that understood one very inconvenient truth. Burning brightly all night is impressive, but dimming the light on time is what keeps the walls standing. Baghdad did not defeat darkness. It simply refused to waste fuel arguing with it, which, historically speaking, is an underrated survival strategy. If this story feels calm, that is not an accident. Baghdad would probably be offended by anything louder. It preferred habits over headlines, pauses over performances, and systems that worked even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. So thank you for staying with this city while it quietly did nothing remarkable, and therefore managed to remain remarkable for centuries. Thank you for not rushing the night, and wherever you are, may your fire stay small, your light dim when it should, and your energy be saved for tomorrow. Good night, and until our next quiet city.